Thank you very much indeed, Nick. So thank you for booking me, people. And as I said earlier on, I've rubbed shoulders with quite a few dowsers over the years because what I'm about to talk about here is a lifetime's interest. So um, I can't remember a time before I was obsessed with the paranormal. I'm not going to bore you with the possible explanations for that. I've become quite a skeptic in some ways over the years, and in other ways, probably one of the least skeptical people amongst skeptics in this area, which I hope will explain itself. Along the way, I've written, researched, done live talks, more things than I can usefully count, but you're looking at a couple of books here. So the book on the left-hand side came out last year. I co-wrote this with one of my ex-students, actually. The nearest thing I had to a long-term job that I did forever. I was an academic from my early 20s till I was nearly 60, and the last long-term posting in that I had was that I started and ran the first higher education course in professional writing in the UK. And EK Knight was one of the students. That's a book about why we all benefit from having some element of the mysterious in our lives. I would assume I'm preaching to the converted with that idea if I'm talking to a group of dowsers. The book on the right is one of the more recent books I wrote about UFOs. UFOs, aliens, and the battle for the truth, and it is pretty much what it claims to be. So the talk that I'm giving today, which is called Adventures in Ufology, is very much about the way that, as a result of a lifetime's interest and all the work that's gone with it, I found myself learning from particular examples. So when I say Adventures in Ufology, what we're going to talk about here, as I would say, astounding tales and cautionary tales. In that book about UFOs, aliens, and the battle for the truth, there is a chapter called Astounding Tales, which are stories that are just so incredible that they challenge what you think you know, i.e., effectively they're stories where aren't easy answers, and these are linked to UFO mysteries. But by the same token, one thing I've experienced over the decades of obsession with this is that there are cautionary tales. Sometimes things will happen that absolutely challenge you in a different way, and you realize that you were possibly going in the wrong direction for a long, long time. I don't know if we've got any people who would claim their knowledge of ufology is particularly strong in the room, and I'm aware that there are quite a few people in the room, but if you are, have you any idea who said the thing that's on the slide there? If ever there's a subject that needs rescuing from its own supporters, it's this one. That was actually said by a famous ufologist. And shout out any names as I'm going through because I'm quickly going to answer that question. Anybody?
I don't know Jacques Vallée.
Okay. Well, we'll come to this because it's quite interesting. This is a Wikipedia definition, so this is one of the reasons I don't mind you recording the talk, because if I give this talk in a couple of months' time, it may well be that the Wikipedia, which is editable by anybody, has slightly changed its definition. But the Wikipedia thinks ufology is the investigation of unidentified flying objects, but the key word at the bottom of that is that the Wikipedia reckons it's a pseudoscience. Without blathering on, I'll tell you something. This is a suspicion I've got that I can't prove. The Wikipedia, I think, is fed up with ufologists going to the ufology page and editing it. My evidence for that would be it's an unusual Wikipedia page in that it's not a very big page, and yet if you look at the worldwide interest, it's massive. And the Wikipedia page on ufology is not that much bigger than the Wikipedia page on Elvis sightings, for example, which is quite skeptical, but at the same time quite open-minded about the people who are claiming it. I get a sense of a certain tetchiness about ufology when I look at that Wikipedia page, and my guess is that the editors are actually fed up with it, and that pseudoscience is effectively a science that is not supported by falsifiable evidence, i.e., it imitates science in a lot of the ways it presents its findings, but it actually doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. Wikipedia thinks ufology is that animal. I think they have a point. And just to give you a shorthand on this, in 1979, there was a competition opened up by New Scientist magazine to write an essay, an article about ufology. it was won by a guy called James Oberg, who's now a famous journalist, but was then a NASA engineer. And he wrote an article called The Failure of the Science of Ufology. And as a scientist, he just demolished the methodology by which people had investigated UFO claims. 20 years after that, I wrote a piece for an annual book that's long since ceased publication called Fortean Studies, which was an offshoot of the Fortean Times magazine. So it investigated strange phenomena, but Fortean Studies aimed for things that were approaching the standard of academic papers in terms of referencing and how they stood their evidence up. And I had a look at James Oberg's paper and more or less revisited it 20 years later, and I tended to agree with him. So ufology has a lot of interesting things to tell us. It's not been well served by attempts to present its work in a way that would impress scientists or skeptical journalists. And interestingly, this is the guy that said if ever ufology needed rescuing, Timothy Good. I used to talk about this in talks and people would accuse me of making it up. People who were pro-UFO, people who thought that UFOs were alien spacecraft. They said Timothy Good wouldn't have said that because his best-selling books, Above Top Secret and Beyond Top Secret, which have exceeded over 1 million sales between them, are very pro extraterrestrial involvement in the history of the Earth. But he actually said it. There's your reference if you want to go and check it out. Seriously, I've been shouted down for suggesting that in a live room, but you can actually go and check it out. Ufology is a subject that has been largely skewed by the people who are the strongest proponents. It's driven, as I'll show you, to a certain extent by kind of media ideas and things that what will sell well tends to be the kind of given message that people first encounter, which includes pro-ET stuff. So very, very briefly, sorry, it's the road to this afternoon in one slide, isn't it? My bad. A very short history. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a tickly throat, so I will keep swigging water. A short route to my current presentation. I can't remember a time before I was interested. Well, as I was growing up, there was one UFO book in the house which my dad had bought, which is the book that you're looking at, Flying Saucers Have Landed. And I would thoroughly recommend people to read it. It's 71 years old now. It's remembered for the contribution of a guy called George Adamski, who claimed in his part of that particular book, he claimed to have met a man from Venus in the desert in California in the early 1950s. He was one of the first what were known as contactees, i.e. humans who'd been contacted by aliens. Now, a couple of things about Flying Saucers Have Landed. First of all, the bulk of the book, the vast majority of the book is not written by George Adamski. It's a very erudite history of strange things seen in the skies. It pillages historic literature, including Sanskrit, the Bible. It's got a heck of a lot of really interesting things to say, and it's a very well-written book. George Adamski's thing is a bit of an add-on, but one route to where I am is that I read this thing when I was about 12 or 13 because it was in the house, and it's got photographs in it, which if they were true, there would be no argument. And I remember talking to my dad about this and him saying, well, you know, obviously, if you could prove that photograph, there would be no argument. But the bottom line is, it's ufology in a nutshell is often fantastic claims with seemingly amazing evidence that does not stand up. I would argue that, I mean, you can Google this. George Adamski's claims have been largely refuted now, and people can up to and including the brand of domestic light fitting that doubles as a UFO in the photographs, basically. But I've never stopped believing. I've never stopped being interested. And another watershed moment for me is the book on the right. The biggest UFO case in history, i.e. more hours of documentary footage, more books written, museum, the rest of it, is the infamous Roswell incident, which allegedly involved the crash landing of a flying saucer, i.e. a UFO, in the desert in New Mexico near Roswell in July 1947. And interestingly, it just happened to be very close to the one and only nuclear armed air squadron at the time. The only bombers on Earth that had live nuclear weapons to hand were those stationed near Roswell in New Mexico. So it's an intriguing case from a load of angles. But in the 1990s, a man called Carl Flock was given money by a thing called the Fund for UFO Research, which is exactly what you would imagine it would be. It was a bunch of interested people gathering as much money as they possibly could, putting the best investigation behind UFO cases. The intention of the Fund for UFO Research was to do such good research that they would convince the scientists and the critical journalists who'd long disparaged the claims of ufology. They would convince them that they were right. Carl Flock had more time and money than anybody ever to investigate Roswell, and the case fell apart in front of him. He came to the conclusion of two things, really. Number one, what was driving it was the will to believe amongst people. Secondly, that there was from a scientific point of view, you could falsify the story. You could prove that something else likely caused it, specifically the crash of a top secret weather balloon experiment, which was a particular thing called Project Mogul, which is now all over the internet. You can read about this, which was a development, an American defense development, the intention of which was to use multiple hot air kind of weather balloons with an attached target on them to spy on the Russian nuclear tests. So I'm a bit skeptical, but I haven't stopped being intrigued. And the guy at the bottom is one of the reasons why I've not really fallen out of love with this. One thing that my whole history of investigation, talking to groups, meeting people, everything like that has taught me is that people have the most incredible experiences. For my money, the most interesting cases are the ones that are a bit surreal because you can't easily dismiss them. They just aren't obvious one size fits all demolitions of these cases. The guy you're looking at is called Alfred Berthoud. In 1983, specifically on the 12th of August 1983, Alfred Berthoud was fishing by a canal bank near Aldershot, more or less where he's photographed there. And according to his own testimony about this afterwards, he was in the early hours of the morning and a UFO landed. He saw two beings come towards him, humanoid beings, and they beckoned him towards them. He couldn't see the UFO because it had come down behind some foliage near to where he was fishing. So he followed them, at which point he could see the UFO. The beings had disappeared, but there was a doorway open on the UFO. He went in, couldn't see anybody, but he heard a voice. Although he couldn't see any speakers, he didn't know where the voice was coming from. And the voice asked him how old he was. And he pointed out that he was approaching his 78th birthday, at which point he was told he was too old and infirm for their purposes. So he walked back and started fishing and saw the UFO take off. Now, Alfred Berthoud had quite a tough life. He'd been a combat soldier. I mean, as in he'd literally dodged bullets. He trapped wild animals in Canada for their fur. So he was a guy he wasn't a guy that scared easily. And by his own admission, he didn't want any publicity. He only went to the local paper because he was looking for somebody to corroborate what he'd actually seen. And he died not long after that, but his wife, who outlived him by several years, insisted that he never made this up. Long story short, I've met a lot of Alfred Berthoud. I've met people who've told me incredible stories that do not match with each other, but have at a core some kind of life-changing experience. So I'm going to give you 5 what I would call astounding stories and 5 cautionary tales, which lead me to the current position about where, what I think about this whole thing. But it sort of take you through that journey in 10 examples, basically. Let's start with an astounding tale. This is William James, brother of Henry James, the novelist. William James was a psychologist, really, before such things existed. And his most influential book, By Common Consent, was published in 2002. And it says there, few books have had such a wide-ranging and enduring impact as the varieties of religious experience. I'm still absolutely in awe of the way that he goes through codifying mystic experiences. So in other words, William James, looking at the way that we understand and interpret religion, codified mystic experiences. He said that effectively for a mystic experience to be a pure mystic experience, it has to be all those 4 things. Ineffable. There's something hard to define about it. Noetic. There is some element of knowledge passed to people. Transient. So they're typically very short-lived. And passive, i.e. the people experiencing them don't necessarily go looking for them. For better or worse, I would claim Alfred Bertou's case was such a thing. Totally changed his view of life. He couldn't quite define what was going on. It didn't last very long. He was certainly not thinking about that when he was fishing on the canal bank. It happened to him. And a lot of the most convincing tales of encounters with UFOs, for me, certainly the people I've met, they fit that model because apart from anything else, in terms of the noetic thing, people change their view of things. They seem to have some kind of knowledge passed to them. I've met quite a few people who have had what would be unspectacular UFO experiences, but these have changed their lives. Relationships have ended, they've changed jobs, they've thought about doing something more useful to the community as a result of their experiences. So people have mystic experiences. All right. And these are some examples. I told you about Alfred Bertou. I won't go into detail on this, but I will tell you if you wanted to go and have a look at them, where you can find more about it. Well, the internet, obviously. The guy in the top left is called Joe Simonton. In 1961, he encountered a hovering UFO, which, amongst other things, had a griddle in it, where the occupants were cooking, and they gave him a pancake, and the pancake was subsequently analysed, and it was a pancake. Absolutely no evidence that was anything alien about it, other than the story that Joe Simonton told about how he came by it. If you wanted a truly jaw-droppingly surreal British case, the infamous Mince Pie Martians event of the 4th of January 1979 is probably a go-to. A very long story short, something strange clearly happened in the garden of a house in Rowley Regis in the Midlands, because a circle was burnt was melted in the snow. There was heavy snow covering at that point. In fact, I remember that January quite well. There is a photograph my brother-in-law took of me. I'm standing 150 feet out on a lake because it's frozen. I grew up in the Lake District. So this was around the same time. It was a very cold spell, but the gist of it is the housewife alone in the house who just waved her husband off to work, then saw these strange alien creatures that flew through her house, reacted in horror as she lit up a cigarette. And it's known as the mince pie Martians because at one point she offered them a mince pie because there was some left over after Christmas. Seriously. But let's have a cautionary tale here. People believe all kinds of things. People are amazed when they see the evidence, and sometimes they don't know where the evidence came from. These two are infamous. Both, I believe, deceased now. Certainly Doug is. Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley. Doug on the left, Dave on the right. If you remember the newspaper started by Eddie Shaw called Today, the daily newspaper, one of the few exclusives it got over the rest of Fleet Street was these two. Doug and Dave hoaxed crop circles for years and quite probably started the whole craze for crop circles. And hidden in plain sight was the evidence that these things were hoaxed. Apart from anything else, their circles had a habit of appearing overnight between Friday and Saturday. Doug and Dave were both artists. And amongst other things, they were fond of a pint or 3 or 4 on a Friday night, at which point they would go out and hoax circles. And this is how they did it. And when they got fed up with the hysteria, and also they had a comical but life-changing incident whilst hoaxing a crop circle, and I've forgotten which one of them was hit, but they were in a field hoaxing a crop circle in the early hours of the morning, and one of them was hit by something strange and gooey and smelly. And they realized very quickly that a passing aircraft had discharged its toilet right on top of them. And that's part of the legend now. If you look, there's a cracking book about this, about crop circles, called Rounding Circles, came out 28 years ago, written by an American journalist called Jim Schnabel. The point is, he's an American journalist. He's living in London. He's interested in crop circles. He goes and investigates them, largely because he's already written a book about aliens, and you can see the publisher saying, we can get another one of these. Somewhere around the middle of the book, having met all the leading researchers, Jim Schnabel finds himself in a field hoaxing a circle, at which point you realize that it's about the community and not necessarily about the paranormal causes thereof. Doug and Dave created circles. It's out there in the public domain. There's even a YouTube video if you want to see them in action. All right. And here's another cautionary tale. There are loads of hoaxes out there, so I won't bore you with all of those. I'll talk about two in particular, which are British here. The team who hoaxed Flying Saucer Review, again, you can find this on the internet, but the gist of it is this. Flying Saucer Review was a leading publication to do with UFO investigation in the UK. There was a Skywatch on Cradle Hill in Wiltshire, which was a UFocal, as they called it. At the time, the Warminster around Warminster in Wiltshire, there was a lot of phenomena, people reporting them. There are books written about the Warminster thing. But in the middle of all of this, a bunch of scientists hoaxed the Skywatchers with a light on top of a car that was visible from the hill. And they had a plant in among the Skywatchers who apparently spotted a UFO, at which point everybody got interested. It led to a pseudo-scientific article in Flying Saucer Review, at which point the hoaxes revealed themselves. Caution, some of the best evidence is definitely hoaxed. What I'm going to tell you now, the Flying Saucer from Mars is not the best evidence, but it's a cracking hoax story. After George Adamski's best-selling claim about meeting a Venusian in the desert in California, within a couple of years, there was a British equivalent, Flying Saucer from Mars. Cedric Allingham had met a man from Mars on a Scottish beach, and it's blatantly a wind-up because it's pretty much the same story as George Adamski told. That's apparently an informal portrait of Cedric Allingham on the right-hand side. I mean, if that's the guy being informal, you wouldn't really want to find him on a bad day, would you? And I talk about this in a number of different talks I give. And a few months ago, I just casually said in the middle of a talk, well, what's the strangest creature you've ever met on a Scottish beach? And a lady in the audience shouted back, Donald Trump. It's an interesting story. She hadn't met Donald Trump. She'd been on a Scottish beach walking her dog. 4 big black SUVs had shown up. All these big security guys had got out because this is where Trump was building his golf course. So these guys had got out to try and intimidate everybody and get them off the beach because there was some discussion about the golf course going on. And behind them, she could see Trump. But he never came anywhere close to the public. But the point about Flying Saucer from Mars is it filled a few people. It was blatantly a hoax. The guy behind it was Patrick Moore, the TV astronomer. And Patrick Moore was a wonderful hoaxer. I'll tell you later on about a guy called Sir George King, who started a UFO-based religion. When King's religion was first underway, one thing he would do was channel alien intelligence. He would go into a trance in front of a live audience in London usually and channel an alien intelligence, which would then answer any question from anybody on Earth to prove that it was a greater intelligence than what we were dealing with. George King had a bad night when Patrick Moore turned up. I didn't know this, but Patrick Moore could speak Norwegian. Patrick Moore asked a question in Norwegian, and despite being super intelligent, this alien he was channeling couldn't speak Norwegian and therefore couldn't answer the question. So be cautious, All right? But let's be astounding as well. This is one of my current favorite UFO authors. And I gave a talk a while ago called The Best Ufologists Aren't All Ufologists. Diane Walsh-Pasulka probably would not see herself as a ufologist. What I'm telling you there is basically what happened. She's a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Wilmington. This is her background there, but she's written 2, I would argue, quite important books about ufology, specifically these. And this is how it happened. American Cosmic, which for my money is the better of the two, she, as a professor of religious studies, became amazed at the level of belief in America in the notion that the Earth had been visited by aliens and we'd encountered aliens was roughly on a par with the belief in God. And as a professor of religious studies, she wasn't aware of this. And having discovered it, she found it to be quite an amazing, it was a thought that wouldn't go away, basically. And American Cosmic is her attempt to explain it. She goes to the people that she would most trust to be rational, intelligent, thinking people and asks them what they think and looks at, the Gallup poll surveys and the evidence about how many people believe. A more recent book, Encounters, is her exploring, as it says there in inverted commas, sharing the work of experts across a spectrum of fields who are working to connect humanity with unknown life forms. And there are some interesting takes in encounters. NASA, for example, working with First Nations people in the United States, and I don't know whether you'd call it banter or a frank exchange of views. A big wake-up call for some of the Western scientists is that the academics and the leaders of First Nation communities have often said to them, do you not get this? Yeah, your science is wrong. Actually, everything is sentient, which is something we'll come to later on. So that there's consciousness talking to us in ways that we just refuse to listen to at the moment. All right. And there are other people, Gerrit Verschuur, if you look at those names on there, or John C. Lilly, both of these two in their own ways were also interested in how alien intelligences might manifest. John Lilly is begging a bloody biopic. It would just be an incredible story. He was one of the first people to break from SETI in the 1960s, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And John Lilly's point was simple. If we want to understand how to speak to advanced intelligences that don't think and communicate like we do, we would be much better off talking to dolphins and trying to understand them than trying to understand alien messages, because at least we know where dolphins live, where we can find them. We've got some crude understanding of their language. And when I say John C. Lilly would be begging a biopic, apart from anything else, he was rich to the point where he actually managed to convert a house that was a shared living facility for humans and dolphins. I'm thinking that would make a great movie. But the point I'm making is that one thing I find astounding is that the more time I spend looking at people who are trying to understand how we would communicate with alien intelligences, the more I see that the question here is not simple. You know, Western science appears to have hit its limits there, and we would be better sometimes listening to First Nations or just investigating intelligent animals, because we might learn a lot more quickly. So let's get back to a cautionary tale. I spent a lot of my academic career, one way or another, teaching people to work in the media and to be critical of the media, including 20 years with professional writing. So I'm well aware that the messages that the media puts out there do shape our own understanding. So I've shamelessly taken quite an extreme example here. The guy on the right in the, well, they're both in quite garish get-up, aren't they? She's still alive, Selke. She recorded one of their songs recently. I'll come to this in a second. But Kimberly Barrington Frost, who the date of birth and death there from Sheffield originally, who was known as Ramesses because he had a vision from the Egyptian pharaoh god telling him he was a reincarnation. Now, at this point, he was a central heating salesman in Scotland in the 1960s. Excuse me, but I would imagine selling central heating in Scotland in the 1960s, you can't go wrong, can you? So if you're gonna throw that career up, you better need a good reason. Well, Ramesses indicated that he was the reincarnation, and there was a particular way that he had to share this cosmic vision, because it's way more than just Ramesses. It's to do with alien involvement in the history of the Earth and the rest of it. And the obvious route, apparently, according to Ramesses, was through rock music. I don't know how many music fans I've got listening to me at the moment. I mean, if you see behind me, I'm sitting in a room full of vinyl here. I wrote a book called 500 Albums You Won't Believe Until You Hear Them, which includes a discussion of the top album there, Space Hymns. The point I'm making is there are very strong personal beliefs. People become obsessed with these things. They follow these obsessions to what would appear to be very extreme limits of eccentricity. Let me just go there for a second. I'm from West Cumbria, and one thing I would tell you about local dialects in this country is that sometimes there are words that don't literally translate. We have a thing in West Cumbria called a raj, and it doesn't literally translate into the English language. A raj is somebody who is way beyond eccentric but short of mentally ill. And Ramesses is a raj. End of, you know, his entire career. I mean, this is not funny because his death in 1976 was a suicide to do with the failure of this career of his. But he made two albums which are just centrally to the message. of, the Earth's been visited by aliens. If you don't get it, Space Hymns, which is by far the better of the two albums, includes a rocket taking off, but the rocket is literally the steeple of St. George's Church in Stockport. He believed that church steeples were attempts to recreate the shapes of alien rockets that had visited the world in the past. I mean, so in other words, we hidden in our religious iconography was the blatant evidence that we'd been visited by aliens. And I mean, how lucky do you get? He recorded it in Stockport in a place called Strawberry Studios, which was being set up by some musicians there. The house band at the time were the four guys who went on to form 10cc. So it's actually quite a good listen. I mean, he's supported by some of the best pop musicians of that generation. On the other hand, it is absolutely bizarre. And the popular media has played with alien iconography, alien ideas, to such an extent that they've informed all sorts of things in terms of how we go about our lives. So these are two examples here. The one on the right is a compilation of lo-fi kind of novelty records to do with aliens and stuff from the 1950s. The one on the left is what they used to call ambient techno, i.e., sort of 30 plus years ago, the kind of stuff that was played in chill out rooms. But the band Eat Static, who have virtually no lyrics in their records at all, played with alien iconography, and their song titles are to do with things to do with UFO belief. So all of these things shape our understanding, science fiction, TV, films, all the rest of it. There's always a popular view of how things are. And I would say it shapes a lot of how we understand the phenomena, regardless of what the phenomena are. Right, back to an astounding one. So let's follow on from Diane Pasulka for a minute. This is Philip Goff. He works at he's a philosopher working at the University of Durham. So if you know your academia, you don't idly, there are some universities where it might be easy to get employment. Durham is not one. You've got to be fairly good, right? He is not a ufologist. But when I argued about the best ufologists not being ufologists, I put this guy forward. He's currently Britain's leading advocate for panpsychism. And there's a quote there, right? His argument, and this is a absolute travesty of a complicated argument, but the argument is crudely this: Western science went wrong with Galileo. The notion that we could quantify and explain things. In other words, if we investigate material and maths, we understand. His argument is no, we don't. It helps us to understand, but a lot of the missing connections when we're looking for the reasons why the universe might behave like it is are to do with panpsychism. Crudely, that there is consciousness and intelligence throughout the universe. And he's predictably then, he's written a book about it. And I would argue it's possibly one place where dowsers and ufologists meet. We see evidence of things that other people can't, but at the same time, we're intuiting certain patterns in the evidence and reasons why it might exist. And it sort of seems to erupt randomly, certainly in terms of the way that skeptical people see it. My experience as a ufologist has been that I'm ambushed in the most random and unexpected ways by people who tell me the most bizarre things. And if you write them all down, they're not consistent. If you write the underlying pattern down, they are. And Philip Goff's take on it is that it might just be random encounters with a consciousness that's so big and complicated we can't understand it. But the one thing that all these encounters suggest is that there is a consciousness there. Let's go back to a cautionary tale. So about 30 years ago, 13th of April 1996, getting on for 30 years ago, just before the internet, you could make good money writing for newsstand magazines about the paranormal. There were magazines like Uri Geller's Encounters and stuff like that out there. And the X-Files was huge. These magazines and the newsstands were selling. They needed content. People like me could get paid good money to put stuff in them. And I'd been on Radio Kent, BBC Radio Kent, talking about UFOs, and a guy rang me called Justin Williams. I'm still in touch with Justin to this day, but I'd not met him before then. Justin was then a journalist on the Kent Messenger newspaper, which was the big local paper in my area. And he said, he rang me and he said, he heard me on the radio. He was writing a series called Kent X-Files at the time. And he'd heard me talk about quite a few things. So he asked, would I mind coming into the office? So he and I sat opposite sides of his desk for just over half an hour, and we swapped information. Clearly, he was looking at things which I'd either heard of or didn't know about, and he told me one or two things which made me think I could get articles for these different magazines that were out there. I told him one or two things and gave him some contacts which helped to write his Kent X-Files series. And we had we were both quite skeptical, but we had a really good chat. We got on really well. And it was very easy to just do that particular meeting. A few days later, I followed up something he mentioned. There's a place called Dargle Cottage. It's near Tenterton in Kent, and it's a complicated story. The short version is this. A retired couple, the Verneys, had moved into the cottage. They'd had it as a weekend retreat while they'd had their professional careers in London. This was their retirement home. They were plagued with strange phenomena, mainly lights, and they became convinced that there were nothing alien about this. They became convinced that there was secret electronic warfare experiments going on in a bunker on a farm nearby called October Farm. Now, the case was long dead when I spoke to Justin, but I'd never written anything about this. I'd only vaguely heard about it. I learned loads more talking to him. And I thought, well, there's an article in this. So when I'd finished talking to him, I rang up one of the newsstand magazines. They were up for this. The following Saturday, which was the 13th of April, 1996, I went to Dargle Cottage. And at that point, my wife was training as a psychotherapist. So I was left in charge of our two boys. The eldest was a teenager and he was off in town with his mates, so he wasn't a worry. Our then 3-year-old, I had to look after him that day. So we went on a local steam railway. It went perfectly. He duly fell asleep in the back of the car, which meant I could go to Dargle Cottage with him snoozing in the back of the car, pull up with my camera, run up and take a few photographs. Fine. I was coming down a grass bank with the camera, and a Vauxhall Astra came round the corner with a young couple in it who looked for all the world like Mulder and Scully. And instead of passing me, they sat and looked at me. So I pulled out. They followed me. Again, long, complicated story. But it was obvious by the time each of us had pulled a move on the other one 2 or 3 times that there was a car chase on. Whatever the hell I'd done, I'd clearly alerted the security forces, and this was not good. So in the end, I ended up turning off the main road without indicating and finding my way back home. And whilst all this was going on, the world had truly gone mad because I was listening to the football report, and if anybody remembers that afternoon, Manchester United had just been beaten by Southampton. Alex Ferguson's excuse was that his team were wearing the wrong colour shirts and they couldn't find each other on the pitch. So it was a truly surreal afternoon. On the Monday morning, I rang Justin. I'm at work at college, and I rang him up and said, I was at Dargle Cottage on Saturday, and started telling him the story about being chased by MI5. And he interrupted me and just screamed, "You bastard," down the phone. Now, the rest of it is actually quite easy to explain. After he called me a few choice names and we'd had a frank exchange of views, he told me why he was insulting me. He said, "That was me in that car." Yeah, right, absolutely, you get it. We'd sat on the Wednesday saying, yeah, we're interested, but we're skeptical. We wouldn't fall for any of that garbage. On the Saturday, neither of us had spotted the other one because we'd seen exactly what we expected to see. His first reality check was somebody was running up the bank there with a camera, behaving oddly right outside of Dargle Cottage. My take on it was those two people don't look like they belong in the Kent countryside. And the reason he was howling at me was he was terrified. He'd done something that had scared the life out of him. He'd rung a policeman on the Saturday who'd run a check on my car number plate. This was a 9-month-old Rover saloon, which belonged to the Kent Motor Pool at the time. It was my wife's works car. She was employed as a senior manager at KCC at that point. And he knew something I didn't know about that car. it was a go-to surveillance because you could park that anywhere from the Pantiles on Tunbridge Wells to Bluetown on the Isle of Sheppey, which that's the probably your biggest social mobility journey in Kent, and the car wouldn't look conspicuous. He completely missed the child seat in the back. He'd seen that there were two security passes. It hadn't occurred to him that one was for the college where I worked and one was for County Hall where my wife was based. Um, yeah, but cautionary tale. I've been to loads of UFO conferences where people have seen strange things going on around locations known to be linked to UFOs. And sometimes I've gone and investigated them myself and not bothered to share. So somebody once told me that at Rendlesham Forest, which is one of the most famous UFO locations in the UK, not far from Rendlesham Forest, they thought there was radiation in the ground linked to a UFO crash, and their evidence was they'd seen two people in boiler suits going to a Land Rover having taken some soil out of the ground. I rang my mate who's a hydrogeologist and said, well, is that what you do? And he said, yeah. In other words, they probably spotted hydrogeologists at work. They hadn't seen MI5 monitoring the radiation from a crashed UFO. Okay. I met this guy. Let me just have a bit of a rant here. If you want to look into the history of the Ministry of Defence and UFOs, there's a guy out there at the moment called Nick Pope, who is often billed as the guy that ran the UFO desk at the Ministry of Defence. I won't go into this. Just go and find a website called Nick Pope Watch. It's a WordPress site. What it looks at is the distance between the claims made about Nick Pope and the provable reality. By complete contrast, nobody talks about Ralph Noyes, and they should do, because I was in a research group with Ralph for a long time, and he was absolute gold. Ralph was part of the Ministry of Defence. This is an astounding tale for you. Ralph is what he claimed to be. Worked at the Ministry of Defence between those dates, retired with the rank of Under-Secretary, which means that he was briefing cabinet ministers for parliamentary answers. So I think the last Defence Secretary during Ralph's tenure would have been Dr. David Owen. So Ralph was, if David Owen needed to answer questions specific to things to do with the, operations of the RAF in particular, Ralph was your go-to. And Ralph was very approachable. I loved being in a research group with him. I was then very young, and Ralph was absolute gold. If you went up to him in a coffee break and just dropped a name that you knew very little about, Donald Menzel, for example, who was significant in American ufology in the 1950s, I remember mentioning to Ralph, you wouldn't get a word in edgeways for the next 5 minutes, but everything he said was like, it was just like going to the internet and downloading what you needed to know. Now, interesting, Ralph would openly talk about a few things. And one thing he regularly said, which was, just conversation at UFO conferences and stuff, that during his tenure, those 3 incidents that I've got listed there were the only times his employers, the word he used was excited. And in all cases, he put it down to this. His view of it was that the MOD, whilst it didn't admit this, was investigating UFOs and had been through most of his working life. And they'd come to 2 conclusions. Number one, there was genuine evidence out there, loads of it, to prove that stuff was happening that nobody could understand. Number 2, there was no evidence that it was extraterrestrial. Cutting another very long story short, those 3 moments of severe excitement at the MOD were all down to the same thing. They are incredible cases, all worth a Google. But Ralph's take on it was that the MOD was excited in all 3 cases because something happened, a UFO incident happened in such a way that briefly the defence, i.e. Britain's Ministry of Defence, were concerned that it might be hostile enemy action and therefore felt that they might need to take action. And whilst it seems a bit of an outlier, the 1976 Tehran incident is not. It's worth a Google. If you know your history, in 1976, ruled by the Shah, Iran was a very Western-looking Arab nation. It was only the Ayatollahs taking over afterwards, the Islamic Revolution, that changed that. And the Tehran incident is one of the best UFO cases in history. There's a Wikipedia page about it. It involved effectively the Iranian Air Force encountering unknown objects, and it's to this day, it's a go-to for some UFO documentaries and stuff, because apart from anything else, Parvez Musharraf, who was the lead pilot who encountered a UFO, is still around and still talks to documentary makers. But Ralph's take on it was there was no evidence of anything extraterrestrial, but clearly there were phenomena, natural phenomena, that were so bizarre the MOD didn't understand them, and in the wrong circumstances could be taken for hostile enemy action. Cautionary tale. This is the guy I mentioned. Sir George King was busy doing a bit of jiving there with a prayer power battery. In the 1950s, George King was a taxi driver in London. According to his own testimony, he received a telepathic message telling him that he was about to become the voice of the interplanetary parliament. You can imagine the rest. He meets an ascended master, i.e. Jesus, who lands on Holdstone Down in Devon in a UFO. By the end of George King's life, he dies in a mansion in California, and he's founded his own religion. So the cynical view of it, and there's an probably apocryphal tale, we'll never prove it now. There are people who claim that George King turned up drunk at a communist meeting in London, disrupted it in the 1950s, woke up at the end and asked how he was going to make £1 million, and somebody said to him, "Found your own religion, mate." Well, it's too neat a story. I don't know, and I've spoken to the people who put that in there's a book called Flying Sorcery, which is a kind of popular history of ufology in the UK. No, sorry, the Flying Sorcerers, and they can't. I mean, you know, obviously the eyewitnesses to this are long dead, but cautionary tale from me. About 25 years ago, I was writing a book on ufology, the Pocket Essential UFOs book, and I rang up the Aetherius Society because clearly I wanted to include them in the book, and they're lovely people. They're the most user-friendly, totally non-malicious, and instead of visiting them in Fulham, I just happened to be in Devon, and they invited me onto one of their sessions where they were charging up these batteries full of prayer power. So there were 4 of us, myself included, who weren't Aetherians who were there. We stood on top of Holdstone Down in Devon. We chanted for 2 hours Buddhist mantras, Om Mani Padme Hum, while the rest of the Aetherians were in front of us. And on the one hand, you know, you're pretty much hyperventilating by the time you come off. You are buzzing. It's a wonderful, lovely summer afternoon, the Bristol Channel shining in front of you. You know, you're at one with nature. It's wonderful. On the other hand, I do not believe a word of their cosmology, which is complicated, and I'm not going to go into it. But crudely, it's everything in the various major religious texts is right, but they're all ascended masters. So in other words, in the great tradition of Jesus, Buddha, and the Prophet Muhammad, you've now got George King, i.e. Aetherians equate him with all of those people. But on the other hand, the big moment for me, the thing that stayed with me, is I was coming off Holdstone Down and I was talking to these Aetherians, and, you know, everybody's being really friendly and whatever. And I was talking to a dentist and his wife, and they believed every word of this. And I just became very, very aware that had I stopped and said to them, "Look, this cosmology is just bizarre. Can you not see the holes in it?" I mean, number one, they wouldn't have listened. Number two, had I convinced them, all I would have done is made their lives worse. You know, I had nothing to replace that with other than my own skepticism. And it's interesting. Ufology and the stories of ufology and the examples and the fact that you're close to people who've experienced the absolutely unbelievable is like it has got a religious element to it. Provably so, because there are groups like the Aetherians who are religions based on, you know, part of their cosmology is to do with UFOs. If push comes to shove, people say to me, well, like, you know, what's the most convincing case in history? This one. Not the death of Elvis. We'll come to that in a minute. The wow signal. Now, I'm going to qualify this. No joking, we may know within the next 12 months that we're not alone in the cosmos. Possibly better case than the wow signal, if you want to Google this, is an exoplanet called K2-18b, capital uppercase K, lowercase b. Um, there's an exoplanet discovered by the James Webb Space Telescope that's behaving very oddly. It's 3 times the size of Earth, appears to be covered in water, and it appears to have a biosignature. In other words, every time um, the people investigating this try to explain the evidence away in a different manner, they're struggling. So there may be simple aquatic life on an exoplanet, and we may be getting close to being able to prove it. Jules Holland's Hootenanny at the end of last year, Maggie Adair Pocock, who presents The Sky at Night, was one of his guests. And he casually said to her, like, any predictions for this year? And she said, yeah, we might know that we're not alone in the universe, which threw Jules Holland. So I don't think there's any conspiracy on this. It's an interesting thing, but until that's proven, my best take on this is not a UFO case, but my best take on the fact that there's something alien and intelligent out there might be the wow signal picked up on by the Big Ear Radio Telescope, a university-run radio telescope in the United States, on the 15th of August 1977. It's called the wow signal because in those days radio telescopes printed instead of going live on a computer screen, they literally printed out their findings on reams and reams of paper. So a few days later, Jerry Eman, who was running the whole radio telescope experiment, picked up the paper, read through a few days worth of printouts, spotted that 42-second narrowband signal, and it was so much what they thought they were looking for. He ringed it in red biro and wrote wow exclamation mark next to it. We don't need to go into all the ins and outs. The point is that it's such an outlier. It's such a one-off. It's never reappeared, and a lot of time and effort has been put into trying to find it again. It's never reappeared, so nobody knows. All bets are off. Yeah, even the most skeptical paranormal podcasts like Skeptoid admit that it could be anything. I kind of have a joking way of presenting it in some of the talks, and it's this. If you look at the time that signal arrived on Earth, which is late on the 15th of August, and if you look at the likely time of death of Elvis Presley, which is within about 12 hours of that, all bets are off with the wow signal. So until anybody proves otherwise, my argument is it was the Space Brothers calling Elvis home. I mean, there's a serious point to that. All arguments are as good as any other, but until that argument is no more falsifiable than the fact that it was alien intelligence or it was some improbable set of circumstances by which an earthbound signal ricocheted to the point where the radio telescope picked it up. All right. Another cautionary tale. I'm a football fan. I support Carlisle United. In the mid-1990s, around the time Mulder and Scully were chasing me around Kent, actually, we had a chairman called Michael Knighton who promised when he took over in 1992 that he would have Carlisle United in the Premiership within 10 years. The best we ever did was to get relegated from what's now League One under him. Those were our highest league finishes under him. We went to Wembley twice and won once, so it wasn't, but he's not fondly remembered, let's we just say. I was at a UFO conference around the same time. I was told that there was a group called Contact International in Oxfordshire who still exist, but they're very, very sparse and few and far between now. But they had a guy who was channeling super intelligent aliens, and you could ask him any question. So obviously I asked some questions and got an article out of it. 5 biggies, is there global warming? Is there a God? Got sort of predictable non-committal answers. Yeah, there's a God, but not the way that we understand it kind of thing. But I did the curveball question I threw in there. And how much more English could this be? You don't get to meet the guy who's channeling aliens. You send him a letter and a stamped addressed envelope. Lovely, right? Very English. The 6th question I asked was, if you, i.e. if you super intelligent aliens were Michael Knighton, how would you get Carlisle United into the Premiership? Because as somebody who was buying tickets and suffering through the games, I didn't believe it was possible. And they said, no word of a lie, super intelligent aliens told me by stamped addressed envelope, we would bake a cake. The cake would contain the chairman's wishes the players would deliver on the pitch. Anybody following the Euros? I mean, seriously, I don't doubt the sincerity of the person channeling the aliens who told me that. I do doubt whether they're in touch with super intelligent aliens. If that cake recipe existed, forget heavyweight boxing. Just put two premiership managers in the same room as the recipe, right? Um, it's point I'm making is you don't, in the crudest possible terms to do with ufology, you don't need to be mad to work here, but it may help, right? So Timothy Good said the following: if there's ever a subject that needs rescuing from its own supporters, it's this one, right? I'm willing to bet nobody in that dowsing group can now come forward and wave a Bufora membership card, can they?
What is it?
Yeah, what is that? Before?
Well, exactly. Are you a member of an active, the longest established UFO research group in the UK is Bufora. The biggest group is ASA. Okay, those are the logos. The point I'm making is most people are not members of serious research groups anymore. Yeah. Most of what we understand for ufology is people going on the internet, diving into silos and reaffirming their beliefs. All right. Therefore, I would argue Timothy Good was right. I've learned a lot about ufology. At the same time, I agree with him that to a certain extent, the popular message of ufology is one that appeals to a lot of people. It may need rescuing from its own supporters if UFO investigation is to be taken seriously. I think Philip Goff with his panpsychism might be onto something more substantial than people who still want to argue that an alien spacecraft crashed at Roswell. My own take on it is this. I sometimes explain this with reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You're probably aware of this. That's Deep Thought from the BBC series. This is the super intelligent pan-galactic beings, I think they're described as in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book. They want to know the answer to the ultimate question, i.e. the ultimate question is life, the universe, and everything, question mark. They build a computer called Deep Thought, and they program it with all the things it needs to know to answer the question, and it comes back with the answer 42, which is a top comedy moment in both the movie and the books and the TV adaptation. At which point, Deep Thought, the computer, basically says to them, I know you don't like the answer, but you probably didn't ask the right question. And which is comedy gold in the Hitchhiker's Guide series, because then basically what happens is that the next computer that's built to answer the question is the Earth and everything on it. And just when it's getting ready to answer that particular question, it's demolished to make way for a bypass in space. Yeah, really, that's the story. I'm there. My take on this is that decades of investigation, up to and including investigating, people who've been abducted, videos that I'm sent on a fairly regular basis now. I don't think we're smart enough to ask the right questions. I think we're chipping away at the edges. I think that things like the wisdom of First Nations people about the sentience of the earth, panpsychism, certain branches of science are all giving us answers, but I don't think that we're asking smart enough questions to really address what's behind the most mystifying parts of the UFO phenomena. I think Ralph Noyes and the MOD were right. There are strange atmospheric phenomena that up to and including stuff that can fool the best technology available to our military then and now. Fool pilots of fighter planes or whatever. But centrally, people like Alfred Bird too, with his bizarre experience, I don't think there are easy answers. We don't yet know how to frame the questions. Okay, rant over. Any questions on that?
What does he think of the NASA report that was published? Was it last year that gave credence to some UFO sightings?
Did you hear that?
No.
The NASA report, we think last year.
Last year, I think it was.
Yeah, I seem to remember something in the news about there's video footage, wasn't there?
Oh yes, sorry, the Pentagon hearings. Yeah, that's interesting. God, I can't answer that simply, but yes, I've watched all of those and the Pentagon hearings. So the there's two ways of looking at that. So if you like, why don't I answer that by telling you where you'll find your answers. First of all, if you wanted to look at a skeptical take of it, the Skeptoid podcast that I mentioned did a more than one episode. They did 2 episodes on the UFO mafia taking over the government. And if you look at some of the people who are driving this, there's a guy called Robert Bigelow is central to this, and he's worth a Google. There's been a lot of pressure put on Congress and effectively America's top public servants, including politicians, to come up with answers about UFO questions, up to and including the quite popular belief that they've got crashed hardware in places like Area 51. And I think it's really interesting. On the other hand, I don't think that the evidence that they're expecting is going to emerge from there. And for me, look, I've never fallen out of love with this. And sometimes I've once explained to somebody why I'm still bothered, in the same way that the DJ John Peel was once asked about, why do you keep listening to all these strange records? And his answer was, well, I just want to hear something I've never heard before. And I had a real kind of moment of wake up when the Pentagon hearings were going on, because I was watching the testimony of David Grush, who's probably the most prominent of the people who testified. And I was loving it. He was saying all the right things. And I'm still thinking, for all the skepticism, there could be stuff that the American government could be sitting on secrets that they haven't shared. And then David Grush started talking about a crash of a UFO in Italy in 1933. And my physical reaction to that, my heart just sank, because it's a hoax. That story comes from the mid-1990s. I won't bore you with it, but again, there's a Skeptoid episode called Mussolini's Aliens that'll tell you all about that. So a lot of what they're investigating is still being driven by stories and beliefs that are provably hoaxed. The central claim is that the American military have got evidence that is so conclusive of the fact that the technology is alien that they don't want to release it. The Pentagon videos are interesting. I mean, fascinatingly interesting. And I don't know is the short answer. But if you wanted a skeptical, the pro views are obvious. The pilots will come forward and say, we don't know what we were chasing. If you want a skeptical view, there's a thing you can find online called the UFO movie They Don't Want You to See. And there's a guy called Mick West, who's an expert at investigating videos of the paranormal, who turns up on that, and he explains them in a completely terrestrial way. One of which is it's to do with how the plane is in the air, and it's actually what you're looking at is not an alien spacecraft, it's an afterburner of a plane disappearing. There's also a serious possibility, and I'll just say this and then quit ranting. There's a long history of Western military, particularly the United States, testing some of its cutting edge technology against people who don't know what they're looking at. In the 1960s, it was a staple of UFO belief then that there were UFOs that were in the Earth's atmosphere and were flying higher and faster than any aircraft ever could. And they were being picked up occasionally on radar, civilian radar in particular. And the truth of the matter is, they were picking up the SR-71 Blackbird, the spy plane. But of course, they didn't know. Yeah. And it's in it's in a lot of the UFO books from the 1960s. I think it entirely possible that some of the things, the Pentagon videos, might be cutting edge military drones tested against. I mean, it's what the circumstantial evidence to me is that those videos come from planes flying as part of a battle group that was on battle exercises off California. And if you're going to test your cutting edge military drones against anybody, just throw them out in front of that. Yeah. Because if those pilots can't catch them and they don't know what they're dealing with, you've got a fair idea about how enemy pilots might react.
Anybody got any more questions? I come from the Dowsers in this country have a very long history. Going back, the British Society of Dowsers goes back to 1933.
Yeah.
We've got extensive archives of of Dowsers' experiences, you know, including things like, you know, documented PK, things like this. And there's some extraordinary experiences that Dowsers have had outside of the traditional, well, it's just, I mean, just finding water underground, for example, with the traditional thing, you know, is quite extraordinary itself. But it does seem to me that it seems that the dowsing and the ghosts and the UFOs are all on a continuum.
Yes.
And the only explanation, as you point out, really, is just it seems to be that the common denominator seems to be consciousness underpinning reality some way, and this, you know, Jeffrey Kripal, you know, he was a religious scholar, you know, and he I think I quite agree with him that it's like we don't have a good understanding of imagination and the ability of the human mind to interact with this deeper consciousness to create manifestations of reality.
I totally agree, Nick. Yeah, and I mean that's where, if you like, that's where it's taken me. And so your circumstantial evidence would be random, very hard to explain experiences where dowsing is central to how these things happen. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So I'm with you. One thing that keeps me going is that, particularly since I got back to doing live talks, so when I packed up being an academic, I put these bookable talks up where you found me. So clearly, within reason, I can't determine when and where I'm going. I'm just within reason. I'll go to, you know, I'm quite happy to speak to any audience. And consequently, I should have seen this. I'm in the room, particularly the bread and butter gigs and midweek things where you're talking to retirement groups. And invariably, then approached after speaking by somebody who's had the strangest experience, but by their very nature, these people are older than me. And what's interesting is that a lot of the stories I'm hearing are very consistent with what was the kind of popular stories of the UFO books of the 60s and 70s. Yeah. I spoke to a guy recently in Kent who was telling me about a thing his dad saw, which was a spindle-shaped UFO just hovering over the Kent countryside. Now, the point is that they were, you know, spindle-shaped UFOs had their height in the 1960s or early 1970s. This sighting came from about 1973. And the same as with what you're telling me there, the consistency is the uncanniness, the life-changing nature thereof, the way it fits into the kind of, you know, William James model. The inconsistency is the superficial stuff. Nobody sees spindle-shaped UFOs anymore, yeah? Nobody meets tall Nordic aliens, but I spoke to somebody recently who did, albeit she met them in about 1969. You know, and so the common denominator for me is something to do with consciousness that we barely begin to understand. That would be my take on it. And yeah, in which case, to a certain extent, you and I and a ghost hunter are in the same area, I think. We just probably don't all realize it all the time.
Consciousness isn't part of science. It can't be. Science is a materially based subject. Consciousness is excluded from it. So
well, that's Philip Goff's argument.
Never explain this thing.
Yeah. The Philip Goff's book, Why, that I threw in front of you there earlier on, that's pretty much the argument, that he's not disparaging everything that's happened in material science since Galileo. He's simply constructively suggesting that they might be missing a huge part of it. And actually, sorry, I should have mentioned something. If you wanted a crash course in that for free, he turned up on In Our Time with Melvin Bragg earlier this year.
I listened to that,
Yeah, so there is an In Our Time about panpsychism, which is really interesting, yeah.
Have you read Ian McGilchrist, the guy who's, well, he did the Master and His Emissary about the divided brain. He's a philosopher I can't think of the word brain scientist or whatever, but he's particularly good on this subject. I'd recommend that. You need a few weeks of time to work through his tome. You know, he's probably The Matter with Things is well worth a read on this subject. Yeah, it's quite enlightening.
Listen, this is what I do now. Yeah, see, I'm not ready to retire, and I'm certainly not ready to start gardening.
No,
So
just
yeah,
interesting, isn't it? Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed the talk. I thought it was
You're
very
welcome.
engaging, and yeah, keep up the good work. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed for booking me. I appreciate.
Hope to be back in
You're
touch.
welcome, and thanks to all the blurry shapes in the background
Sorry.
as well. Sorry, I didn't get. All
Bye.
right,
Take care.
right, okay. Much appreciated. Go well. Cheers. Bye.
Bye bye now. Thank you. Bye bye.